So today we're going to be talking about the kind of use of psychedelics in Western medicine, the history in the 20th century. But I think maybe a good place to start might be with the kind of indigenous use of plants like peyote in the Americas, because my instinct is this is how it kind of came to the awareness of Western medicine in the first place. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think so. Yeah, I think there was a real fascination by anthropologists and chemists and ethnobotanists in what sort of plant medicines provided. And although there was an independent interest that was separate from indigenous uses, I think some of the indigenous knowledge, indigenous uses of it became a real fascination for scientists. We see this stemming back through lots and lots of centuries, but in the 1920s, that really takes off, particularly I think as there's a desire to sort of extract chemicals out of plants and a bigger investment in pharmaceutical products that we see then taking off throughout the 20th century.
Right. And then, so I guess that leads to mescaline being one of the kind of earliest psychedelics that was kind of studied by psychiatrists. And then do we move into LSD in the 40s?
Yeah, I think mescaline's a really interesting story. And I mean, Mike J has written a fascinating book about this as the first psychedelic. And I know there's some new research going on, new research that looks at this history with fresh eyes, if you will. There's some interesting stories about the ways in which, in particular, sort of German-speaking chemists became very fascinated with the way that you could extract these chemicals or these substances out of the plants. And I think it goes hand in hand with a kind of westernization and even a medicalization or a scientization of plant knowledge and plant healing. And we see in that it's really difficult not to also recognize within that a kind of colonial legacy of then also pulling apart, not just actually physically removing things from plants and studying them in isolation from the plant, but also removing them from those cultural contexts and from those knowledge systems and studying them in a different context or in isolation from what we might think of as traditional or sacred practices.
Right, yeah, I think that's really, I'm sure that's something we'll talk about later as well, is this distinction between traditional, maybe more holistic systems, ways of thinking about health versus the kind of Western reductionist model. And I guess in the West, well, whereas you had kind of, healers or shaman dealing with these substances in traditional cultures, in the West, I guess our equivalent is the kind of psychiatric institution and the kind of medical mainstream. And we see the renaissance that's now going on in research and the renaissance that happened, well, the initial wave that happened in the 50s, which you're an expert in. And it seems that leads the way in the culture, right? In maybe in a kind of, those are the authorities that we follow.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian and not a clinician, so I'm really interested in sort of how these stories are told or which stories tend to stick with us or resonate with us. And I find it really fascinating, which voices we prioritize in this history. And it does seem that over the course of the last 150 years at least, we've tended to trust or sort of put our faith in those who look more like white-coated scientists than even some of the scientists who took off their white coats and grew their hair long in the 1960s or something, though they may have had the credentials, there's still this sort of tension over who are the real authorities on this kind of, you can use different language here, whether it's psychedelics or entheogens or chemical substances or, different ways that people use that vocabulary to claim a kind of position in these debates.
Right.